Hello Fleet, and welcome back to episode 15 of Captain's Academy with your instructor Chase. And in today's episode, I'm going to go over the HE versus AP debate that I had before, except this time I'm updating it for patch 0.4.0. I'm also kind of going to cover where to shoot the ammunition, especially armor piercing. Although, to understand how the whole sort of AP and armor mechanic works, I would recommend you look up the Captain's Academy episode that covered armor angling. Now, without much further ado, here we go. There's a couple of sort of rules of thumb when dealing with HE versus AP. Now, if you're playing a destroyer, either a Japanese or a USN destroyer, you basically shoot HE at everything. With the destroyer-on-destroyer combat, you're trying to disable modules, engines, whatever possible, and try to really kill them as quickly as possible. Also, you don't really want any over-penetration. If you're in a GREM, on the other hand, which is the Russian Tier 5 premium destroyer, the only change here is you shoot armor piercing at cruisers, because you do have the capacity to actually citadel them, because unlike the USN destroyers, for example, your guns don't exactly have a really high arc. They're rather more flat, and also you have a larger caliber main gun, which means that sometimes you can actually penetrate the armor on certain cruisers and be able to do citadel damage. Now, if you're playing cruisers, for all nations, shoot HE at destroyers, battleships, and carriers. But if you run up against cruisers, you shoot armor piercing. And finally, if you're playing a battleship, regardless of what nation you're playing, you shoot HE only at destroyers. For everything else, shoot AP, because your ability to do citadel damage is tremendous with battleships. Yet this brings up the question, why these particular rules of thumb, and why do they work? Well, you've got to kind of know a little bit about how the shells work currently in World of Warships. So one of the things about HE ammunition is it doesn't overpen. So the moment it hits the ship, it explodes and it does damage. However, HE damage can be nullified by higher amounts of armor. So if you took a destroyer and you shot at the belt armor of a battleship, which is really thick, you'll see that you do 0 actual HE damage. But what ends up happening with HE and why it's so significant right now is because fires, you can start a fire, and if you start multiple fires, the fire damage on larger ships is absolutely significant. That is why, as a cruiser, if you're firing HE at battleships and you're setting those battleships on fire, you're doing significant amounts of damage using that actual fire, even though your HE shells themselves might not be doing as much damage as potentially maybe what AP could do if you were able to penetrate the ship. Now, on the other hand, AP is interesting because AP can hit for max shell damage when it hits a citadel, those citadels being magazines and engine rooms. But those areas generally tend to be quite well protected by armor, so typically only larger battleship shells can penetrate, or if it's, let's say, cruiser on cruiser, then the other cruiser which doesn't have so much armor, you're able to penetrate as well. Although taking a cruiser up against a battleship, you can't really pen it with armor piercing unless you're super close. We're talking like around maybe 3 to 2 kilometers, something like really close. Then maybe you can. What the interesting thing is as well is that AP, on the other hand, can overpen ships with lower amounts of armor. So that's why you don't usually want to use something like armor piercing on a destroyer with a destroyer, because your shells can actually overpen that destroyer and do very little damage. Hence why it's better to use high explosive, because high explosive is only nullified by higher amounts of armor. So as a destroyer with very little armor, can't really nullify HE damage. And finally, one last thing about AP shells is that AP shells can still do damage just by penetrating. So if it's not an overpen, but you didn't hit the citadel and it hits the ship, it can still do quite a lot of damage, especially if you're able to land multiple hits. So that is why the only time you would switch from AP to HE is when you're engaging destroyers, because an overpen will only do about 10% of your shell's max damage, and that is very little. So it's just more intelligent to switch to HE to deal with destroyers, but for everything else, shoot AP. So in the next few minutes, what I'll be doing is I'll be showing you some clips explaining why these rules of thumb work, and also when I decide to choose which particular shell and how I'm using them, and also where I'm shooting them at. And so without much further hesitation, let's get going. So first up is a destroyer-on-destroyer engagement where the destroyer uses HE against another destroyer. And this replay actually comes from Sato, so this is actually not one of mine. But as you can see, that first salvo, there's 1,000 damage, and he's not firing a lot of shells. And not only that, but he also set that destroy on fire. Now, Sato does opt to go also for the torpedoes, but he's going to fire another salvo with his guns. Watch the damage. The HE does quite significant damage. There was another 1330 damage there. So it's actually very significant because HE can do very consistent damage and very good damage against destroyers. Now, this replay is one of mine, and I'm in a Grem. And like I mentioned earlier, the Grem, when going up against certain cruisers, you can actually use armor piercing, because if you can citadel them, you can do very good damage. So as you can see, there's one citadel, that's 2,500 damage. The Grem particularly benefits, I think, from the fact that it has larger caliber guns than other destroyers. It has 130mm guns. There's another 2 citadel and 2 target hits, doing 5,000 damage. And this Kuma, which this engagement should have been very favorable for a cruiser to engage in, all of a sudden goes very, very wrong, because when a destroyer knows what they're doing and they know how they're hitting with armor piercing, they can still kill you very, very efficiently. So this Kuma turns aside, very flat armor there, the ideal position for armor piercing ammunition to penetrate citadels. Boom, 2 more citadels, and I get myself that cruiser. This next clip illustrates the rule of thumb for cruisers very, very clearly. So I'm in a Cleveland right now, along with my division mate, the Grey Baron, who's also in a Cleveland. And the two of us have run up against a Warspite. Now, the chances for us at this particular range to try to penetrate the Warspite with AP is pretty much 0. So the two of us have resorted to fling as much HE at the Warspite as possible. Now, the HE ammunition, which explodes on contact, is able to do some damage. It's not going to do the Citadel amounts of damage that AP could do, but the damage is rather consistent and pretty reasonable, assuming that you fire the HE into the slightly less armored portions of the ship, because firing it at the belt armor most likely will negate most of the damage. But not only that, but the fire damage that we can set is really, really awesome, because fire damage does not care about armor whatsoever. It certainly burns off just an X percentage of HP per second, which means that a battleship can get burned down very, very quickly. However, I do spot an enemy Ioba, and I immediately switch from my HE ammunition to AP, and you'll see how quickly this Ioba dies to good hits from AP ammunition. Here's my first salvo, and boom, there goes 7,700 HP, which for a cruiser is a very significant chunk of health. There goes the second salvo, and there's another Citadel and 8 hits. I'm taking off another 5,500. And this Aoba pretty much died in a matter of like 2 or 3 salvos from the 2 Clevelands. So that just shows you how quickly a cruiser can change from one ammo type to another to deal with varying different kinds of threats. Had a destroyer popped up right now, I would have switched to HE and would have been able to deal with him as well. So, of course, the question will come up, what about battleships? I mean, if they get killed so easily by cruisers, what can they do? Well, a battleship using AP, knowing where to hit, hitting the right places, and doing citadels can kill cruisers super fast. So, take a look at this really short sequence, these next 2 clips. First one, there you go. I know it was an injured cruiser. Got him in a salvo. There's another Kuma over there. That Kuma has like 16,000 health left. Watch how quickly this Kuma's HP melts as well. So I'm waiting for the reload. I know battleship reload, this is the thing that kills, so that's why you have to make your shots count, and when you do hit, you have to hit for massive damage, because otherwise you are just going to become food for the little ships that have the faster firing guns. You've got to make your big guns count. Now you see that I'm not really in a rush to shoot there. I'm waiting for the turn to happen. There you go. And once I see the turn happening, I fire the majority of my salvo. The first 2 was really to maybe try to force a turn. There you go. 1 Citadel, 1 hit. There's almost 10k damage. So this cruiser, which up until a moment ago had quite a respectable amount of HP, now doesn't have much left. And that's the thing, when cruisers face off against battleships, if the battleships are using the right kind of shells and know what to do with them, the cruiser doesn't last long enough for its damage over time, sort of fires and everything, to really play that big of a role. A battleship can simply nuke you in like 2 or 3 salvos tops. So that's the rule of thumb for everybody. If you're playing a battleship, the only time I should ever see you using HE is against destroyers. If you're playing against battleships or cruisers or carriers, use AP, learn how to citadel, learn how to do massive damage, and your damage and your experience and everything will increase while you play battleships. Take a look at this next clip for what I'm talking about. This next clip, I'm in an Arkansas Beta, which is one of those ships that has a bit of a shotgun spread, and it's kind of determined by RNG. Nevertheless, there's a full HP Tenryu over there. I've lined up my shot as best I can. I know where I want my AP shells to land, which is straight into the Citadel area, which is the engine room or the magazines, and there you go. 1 salvo, 2 Citadels, 1 hit, and I nail that Tenryu, and I kill it from full HP to nothing in 1 salvo. So that's the key for battleship players. If you are facing off against, cruisers, other battleships or whatever, learn to use your AP ammunition, learn to hit those citadels, because you can actually pull that kind of stuff off, and then you will understand that the battleships are actually really quite powerful with their AP ammunition. And that's all, folks. That wraps up this particular Captain's Academy episode, which has updated the HE versus AP debate for patch 0.4.0. Hopefully this episode has been able to help you decide what particular shell types to use with which particular ships. Remember, if you like what I'm doing, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And aside from all of that, have a wonderful week, good luck on the high seas, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all there.